in the chat box as well as a response, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
What's going on?
Hi, Senator. Sorry, we were waiting for other people to arrive.
Ah,
Yes, so we can actually get started right now. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. My name is Mel Bailey. I am the Communications Officer at Equality Now, working on North America and our Global Ending Sexual Violence campaign. Thank you again for attending our event. There is a title card that you will be seeing shortly, which serves as the backdrop for this discussion, impactful media reporting on FGMC in the United States, a conversation. We're very excited to meet with you all today to discuss this very, very pertinent issue that's affecting over 513,000 girls in the United States and women. We're here today to understand what role the media can help play in pushing to end this harmful practice. Today, you'll hear from a variety of speakers, and I will also just do a few little housekeeping notes and asking all of you to please stay on mute. Many of you, as you're admitted, you will realize that you're muted, so please continue to do so. We'll have a few prompts throughout the discussion within the chat box to allow all of you to engage. And toward the end, we'll also have a question and answer session. I am going to pass over to my co-host, Maria, who will share a little bit more about the background and idea for this event itself, and to introduce the rest of our speakers. Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. And welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to have you all here with us for this conversation around media engagement and FGMC. So, just again, to give some more context about the event today, we're here to talk about media in all its form and the role media can play when we are talking about having a multi-sectorial approach to addressing female genital mutilation or cutting. And by multi-sectorial, I mean having a comprehensive strategy that unites government agencies, survivors, local organizations, provides FGMC prevention, education, builds awareness, as well as support services for survivors at the federal, state, and local levels. And for both those who are familiar and those who are not, we know that FGMC is a deeply rooted social norm within communities and that there is a lot of secrecy, shame, and taboo that surrounds it. And even acknowledging it does not occur. Um, so thereby really thinking about media engagement is one strong way in which we can work to break that silence, to uplift and change that idea of shame and secrecy around the issue of female genital cutting or mutilation, and to address FGMC and create that change. Yet when we think about reporting, particularly for those of us who both work in the field and also who are connected to communities where it is practice or who have undergone it ourselves, we know that it isn't just enough to report, but that we would like for reporting to take this gender and culturally sensitive approach. So we're really here to uplift how journalists, reporters, other media professionals can play a vital role. And again, bringing that deeply rooted social norm, addressing the complexities of it, and bringing it into the public eye so that we can raise awareness, but also address misconceptions around the nature of FGMC, including who it occurs to, how it occurs, where, thinking about local laws, state laws around it, how to uplift the country context. And here where we are uplifting the United States, but also really, we will be looking at FGMC reported globally as well too. So I do want to tell you a little bit more about myself, but I just want to quickly introduce our speakers, and they'll have time to talk more about their own work and their own roles in connection to FGMC. But first off, just to give you all a heads up about who we have here today. We are really lucky to have with us a state senator, Karen Kaiser from Washington State, who was very instrumental in passing the FGMC law in that state in 2023. So it is very recent. Also, we have journalist Emma Batha and Melina Mikhail DeBoss, and documentary filmmaker and producer Melina Warnes. And again, before I turn it over to them to each talk more about this issue, I wanted to tell you a little bit more just about myself. For those who don't know me, again, my name is Moria, and I'm a co-founder and the U.S. Executive Director of SEO, which is an organization that works on the issue of female genital cutting in the US. And then we also have a branch in India. And I'm also a social worker, and I'm someone who's worked in gender-based violence for 15 years. But I am also a survivor of FGMC, and so something that I have known about my entire life. So I come at this issue at a variety of different angles and experiences, including what it's like to speak with the media over the years and seeing how that has changed in the last 10 years as well. Seeing the strength of media reporting, how that really has helped us to create that change, but also seeing how media at times has been utilized to further misconceptions around FGMC. And as advocates in the field, we've seen how that has led to us having to do additional work to create or to really address some of those misconceptions. So we will get into that more, and I'll be able to share a little bit more about my own experiences. But those are just some of the reasons and examples for why we're hosting this. We really want to uplift experiences from journalists, from media professionals themselves, so they can talk about some of the ways that they have worked on addressing this issue, also some of the challenges and some of the things that are simply out of their hands as well too. So I think that we hope everyone here will have a better understanding of the different roles media professionals can take. We hope to talk about what gender and ethical considerations in reporting on FGMC can look like. And we just hope to have a conversation. So at any time, please feel free to write your responses, your comments in the chat box as well too. And we hope to have time to be able to interact between the audience and our speakers as well. All right. So with that context, I have the great pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Washington State Senator Karen Kaiser, who, again, just as a reminder, was the bill sponsor for a bill in Washington, SB 5453, which was passed into law in, I think it was actually April 2023. I believe we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of that law being passed. And I first met the senator when Apsa Samba, who is an advocate and a founder of the Washington Coalition to End FGMC, asked me to take part in a presentation on FGMC that she was invited to give to a few state senators. And I can say that throughout the entire process, Senator Kaiser has really ensured that those impacted have been able to have the opportunity to give input into the bill. And that is something that I have found incredibly refreshing. And I've worked on a few different bills across the country. So the experience in Washington is what I hope the experience can be in other states as well, around really having communities being able to uplift and give their voice as policies are created that impact them. So, with that in mind, for our first question, Senator, I would really love it if you could speak a bit more about the bill and more so in connection with the topic today. And in your experience championing the Washington State bill alongside community members who were impacted by it, what role, if any, did the media play in getting the legislation across the finish line? And overall, just do you find that media can be a tool in advocating for change in law and policy?
Unmute. I'm unmuted. Thank you, Mariah, and all the folks who are here to share and to learn from each other about this important issue. We did pass our bill in 2023. Washington State became the 41st state to enact a law that basically bans FGMC. And it was a follow-up from a bill I actually started working on in 2019 that I couldn't get to move. And it takes a lot of education, and the media is part of that process because people have a lot of misinformation, unfortunately. First of all, we had to clarify that this practice is not a religious practice. It isn't based in any religion in the world. We also ran into issues with somewhat organized groups on social media that are anti-circumcision, and they tried to conflate FGMC with circumcision. So it was somewhat of a difficult communications project, and I have to give kudos to Absa Samsa and all of her members of her Washington Coalition to provide first-person testimony to correct and educate and to elucidate the issue, because it's really something of a hidden issue, in my opinion. People are, and the media are shy about reporting this issue. It's somewhat hidden, and silence, unfortunately, is inherent in this type of gender-based violence. So we have to overcome reticence and squeamishness and embarrassment about this practice as a social norm in many of our communities. I happen to represent a community that is very international in scope. I'm thrilled to say that our Department of Health, because part of the bill has to do with education and outreach, our State Department of Health has just completed a contract which will be implemented by a local group called Mother Africa in conjunction with SAO as a subcontractor. So I'm thrilled about the outreach and education, and that's one of the key parts of this bill. Another part of this bill that was very important to the coalition was to make sure that we created a crime of FGMC as a gross misdemeanor and included a 10-year statute of limitations from the date of the crime or from the victim, who was perhaps a minor, turns 28 years old. So this timeline will give victims the time they need to be able to seek justice. We also included a private right of action for individuals to take others to court, civil court, on this issue as well. So this is a very strong piece of legislation, and I'm very, very pleased that we were able to pass it with really very little commercial media coverage. We had only one story that was picked up by several papers in Washington State. We had a couple of international reports, international stories, but most of our internal communications and social media was the role that we had to play. And I again want to say the personal testimony and experiences that were shared in our public hearings, which are telecast on our local public cable programs, were extraordinarily strong and convincing. The bill passed nearly unanimously and has been signed into law. And I would just say that the 2023 effort was so much more successful than my original 2019 effort. And I do, again, have to give all the credit to the incredible coalition work that was done in our communities around the state to get this law on the books. And I really am pleased that you are spreading the word with these kinds of webinars and conversations so that other states and other communities will be able to share in the effort. So thank you again so much for sponsoring this.
Thank you so much, Senator Kaiser. Yes, I remember thinking like this, there was just so much community support and the sharing the stories and the testimonies that happened and being at those hearings. And again, I've worked in a few other states on this legislation, and I've not seen that as strong as it was in Washington State. It was amazing to see that happening. And with, as rightly you said, in this particular situation, there wasn't as much media engagement. However, there was that community internal communication through social media, through the public, the hearing being televised, as you mentioned too. That was all very strong. And so I think when we're talking about communications, it's important to also help uplift the very various types of communications, right? Even if it's not that traditional media, that still played a huge role, that communications within those communities, bringing people out to give testimony on this, to share their stories. So thank you again in uplifting that point as well. I think I would love to transition to our next speaker, to Emma. And Emma, if you could tell us a little bit more now, just kind of transitioning to more traditional media. You have written and reported about FGMC for years. Could you tell us about the global experience and how do you find and identify those stories? We're talking about the importance of survivor stories and survivors sharing their stories, and we know that that makes a difference. That definitely was something that really touched the legislators in Washington State. What is your process, Emma, of approaching and engaging with survivors and people who are at risk? And I don't know if you're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I started reporting on this in 2012, and I can't stress enough that how important it is to build those contacts with survivors and groups like yours, because that is how you get stories. When I meet survivors or advocates for the first time, I like to spend quite a lot of time and meet them in person if at all possible, because even if it doesn't lead to a story, you're increasing your knowledge and that will inform better reporting. And it also builds trust so that the survivor or the organization understands better what you want or what you need, and they will also be able to flag up other story ideas in future. So that's the main way I find stories, I guess. I do write internationally and in the UK. So another thing that was really invaluable at the beginning of my reporting was some global conferences I attended. I had very limited ability to travel, or pretty much none. I was invited to a couple of conferences and global conferences in Rome, where they flew in activists and survivors and first ladies and politicians from all over the world. And that was tremendously helpful in me being able to, first of all, understand the different contexts that FGM occurs in, and also in making contact with people in everywhere from Chad to India to Iran and Singapore and Kenya. Just people I would not normally be able to have reached out to, and then we could keep the conversations going afterwards. Um, can I talk a little bit about timing, or do you need to? I don't know
Go
quite how
ahead.
much time.
Please
Okay,
do. Yes.
so the other way of sort of coming up with story ideas, I'd say is all to do with timing and looking at what's going on. So when I started reporting, there was growing momentum for a UN resolution, and at home domestically here in the UK, we'd had a law on the statute books for 25 years, and yet there had never been a prosecution. And there was mounting pressure on politicians and prosecutors and police to make sure we did something about ending that and bringing a prosecution and taking action to prevent FGM. So there was a lot going on both internationally and globally for me to write about. But then after you start writing, then it sort of self-perpetuates because you're putting pressure on the politicians and prosecutors and police to take action. And when they launch initiatives or launch prosecutions or pass laws or policies, then that in turn creates more stories to write about. So you end up with this kind of building momentum on both sides, if that makes any sense. So I'd say those are instrumental for finding stories. And then the fourth point I'd make is, even when the coverage sort of died down in the UK, we had COVID. So you can link FGM to other events going on in the world. And COVID, there was quite a lot of evidence that the lockdown increased cutting in many African countries, which I can go into, but it was another route in. So you can always look at other angles and other stories going on in the world and see if there is an angle that would help you sort of expose FGM in other ways.
Thank you so much, Emma.
I haven't actually talked about how I approached survivors, but I can talk about that later.
No, please do continue. I wasn't sure if your pause was to
Oh,
follow up
no, I
on
was just
something.
aware that I'd probably have my allocated time. But very briefly with survivors, I'd say there are two types of survivors. There are the ones who've become very adept campaigners and know a lot about communicating and interacting with the media. But very often you'll be talking to somebody for the very first time, and there you do have a real responsibility to be aware of how, in talking to them, you might inadvertently, when reporting, put them in danger or cause family ructions or humiliate them or embarrass them or diminish their dignity in some way. And I do think also that there was one particular story I wanted to tell about a woman I met who'd never talked to the media before. And as the interview went on, I got the impression that it had almost become like a kind of cathartic counselling session for her, that she'd forgotten I was a journalist, and she had never really been able to talk to anyone about her experiences, and the sort of floodgates open and she told me everything. And there, I think that reporters who do interview survivors will often find that. And you do have a big responsibility to make very clear to the survivor how you want to tell their story and to go through bit by bit and check that they are absolutely happy with everything you are going to report. A lot of media organizations, they have rules that that you can't run a story past an interviewee before you publish, and I can explain why that is, but those are the rules. And I have in the past very occasionally broken those rules where I thought perhaps an interviewee might be at risk and they should see what I'm publishing so I could make absolutely sure I hadn't inadvertently created problems for them. So yes, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you again. Yes, it is so important to touch on survivor safeguarding as well as finding good hooks to be able to place this important issue and be able to actually cover it. And that's very, very challenging in markets like the United States. And that will help me pass over to our next speaker, Milena Mikel DeBas, who is a multimedia reporter and has covered FGM in the US context for quite some time. Milena, could you tell us about your experience, especially regarding using different mediums to be able to report on the reality of FGM in the US? I imagine it's quite different writing about someone and having a camera in front of them. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I think I can kind of start with kind of like my entry point into, reporting on this issue. And that was, back when there was, I don't know how everyone is, but there was a Michigan case where, two doctors were indicted for allegedly performing FGM on at least nine underage girls. Their mothers and other adults were also indicted. And so that was for me the first time I was actually aware that the practice, was taking place, on U.S. soil. And so I had, I grew up in Cote d'Ivoire, so I was familiar with, the practice of FGM and campaigns against it, and I had heard of, vacation cutting as well, but I had never before seen any reports of it taking place on U.S. soil. So I pitched my editors on, because you always need a news peg. So the Michigan case was that, but I knew that I didn't want to just focus on that particular case because it did. I mean, the reality is it did spotlight one particular community, and the reality is the issue is much broader than that. And so I wanted to instead focus on survivor-led efforts to stop the practice in the U.S. And so, I've worked in print and in text, but primarily video. So figuring out how to show that work, the work of survivor activists in action, took time. Took time to build relationships and figure out how to make it visual. So I know I had several conversations with Maria, back then, and I was always asking, okay, what are you guys going to do next? The activist retreat, what does that look like? Always kind of thinking through what kind of, scenes could make it, interesting and visceral. And, by the end, I was able to interview, three survivor activists, just sit down traditional interviews, but also film an activist retreat led by Sayo in New York, and in the DC area, a survivors support group for African women, and a training for law enforcement on signs FGMC might be taking place in their community. And so I think for anyone considering, which medium is the best canvas for the specific story you're trying to tell, I primarily just consider two things. One is, what is my angle? What story am I trying to tell? And how can I tell it effectively? So if you have a story, that's heavy on data, an audio story might not be your first choice. Alternatively, if most of your sources want to be anonymous, a video might not be the obvious choice. And so, in the piece that I did, it was like a 10 minute short doc. One of the interviewees was anonymous, but everyone else was, okay being on camera. And so if you have primarily anonymous sources, you could consider doing a text piece, you know, a faceless photo essay, which is something I considered at first as well, audio or a mix of those. The second thing I consider is resources. There are always greater costs when you're making a video, and more than a text story. So ultimately the time and financial resources I have at my disposal factor into my approach. And so yeah, ultimately I would say that sometimes there are, we've kind of touched on this, but sometimes there are drawbacks to video because one, it can take longer to make, but also it's a much bigger ask of a survivor to recount, some of the most traumatic things that have happened to them on camera. So it can make sourcing a bit more difficult. But ultimately, just as long as you choose a medium that aligns best with the story that you're trying to tell and the resources you have, I think that's the main thing to keep in mind.
I think your earlier mention about not wanting to spotlight one specific community as if that was the entire representation of the United States is really important, or even of the issue of FGM overall. Um, a lot of times we've seen reporting, and even just in conversation around FGM to be harmful and sometimes xenophobic and at times even racist. How could, how do you approach dealing with that kind of difficulty in representing FGM, specifically in a difficult context like the United States? Um, and I mean, this is obviously a question for you, Melina, given your experience, but I can also open this up to others as well.
Yeah, I think like for me that was very much top of mind when I was working on this doc. Something I was very concerned about because I already saw a lot of the xenophobic backlash to the Michigan case. So I I did not want to feed into that. And so for me, that's why it did take a little bit longer because I was in communication with different community organizations, within the African community and South Asian community, to make sure that I was, sourcing and just making sure that the people I was talking to were more representative of the world and the communities that practice, FGMC.
Understood. Thank you. We're also going to share that same question in the chat box to open it up to others as well, so we can get the conversation going. So that way everyone can contribute.
Mel, could I just add that the reason the 2019 effort in Washington State failed was because it was people were worried about it being misconstrued as a cultural issue of xenophobia and racism. And we had to overcome that. And that's why the direct testimony of victims of FGMC was absolutely crucial to overcome that.
Thank you so much, Senator. Does anyone else from the panel have anything to add?
I'll just say that in the UK, I think there was a similar problem about 12, 13 years ago. Although we did have a law, the police had never taken action and prosecutors didn't take action, and teachers and nurses, doctors, social workers, they would never step in because they were afraid of being seen as racist. And it wasn't until survivors started speaking up that I think it sort of really pushed for action to be taken. So that was definitely a factor in Britain some time ago.
Can I add one point? Oh, sorry, Mel.
No, go ahead, Maria. I was just about to ask you to interject anyway, so that's great.
Oh, good. I wanted to add one point too around that. I think one of the things with the Michigan case, and Melina, I was so appreciative that the documentary that you did capture different communities as well. And I think what made it really powerful in Washington was also that the testimonies you had came from a diverse array of survivors from different backgrounds, right? And so really uplifting, I think that nature helps to break that misconception that I think often folks that are not as familiar with FGMC, if you've only heard a little bit, often associate FGMC only with happening within African countries or African diaspora communities. And there has been this huge silence on the issue at a variety of different levels, even at the international UN level. It's changing. A lot has changed in the last 10 years, but that I think was a huge misconception that it's very much a global issue and it can happen to people of many different backgrounds. And I think as we've seen that understanding emerge, we've seen media also uplifting and sharing, that this is something that is happening to different communities. And I think that that's another role that we see that media can play, is breaking some of those stereotypes around who it happens to and who it doesn't happen to. So thank you all for sharing. Is there anything else anyone wants to add to that question before I move on to the next one? Okay. So for my next question, I'd like to ask Melina Warnes also a question. And really, as a filmmaker and producer who has worked on the issue of FGMC, what are some of the responses and levels of engagement with you've seen with complex issues such as FGMC? So really, again, thinking about the different forms of FGMC and anything you'd like to add to that question.
Sure. So, to give a background on that, we have a docu-series that focuses on different issues women face around the world. FGMC was one of those, and it does have a celebrity component to it. And I think from the beginning of working on this project, the one thing that I keep coming back to is we don't give people enough credit. People want to learn about this. From me, when we started doing the research on the subject, to I kind of went down a rabbit hole and I wanted to learn more about the subject matter. And then when we started doing research and we were going to go film in different parts of the world, and I'm talking to my friends about this project, well, they want to know more about it, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And then when it got to the point where we included a celebrity component on this episode, it happens to be Constance Wu, who is an A-list celebrity. She is in Crazy Rich Asians, and she was also in Fresh Off the Boat. She personally chose this topic because she wanted to learn more about it. So I would say we don't give people enough credit is my biggest takeaway. They are naturally curious. They want to wrap their head around this because there is not a lot that is taught about it. And so I think that what we can do to help with that is different forms of media to help people learn about it. We talked a little bit about the journalism. We talked about ours is going to be episodic television. But then what we've also done is we have done bits on social media, and that has gotten a lot of attention. Or even when I'm down and I was posting what I did in social media, the engagement on that, people want to know. As well as we have bits that we are now filming for an impact campaign that's going to go afterwards. So people want to do a deep dive more into how can they help in their local community. People want this knowledge. I mean, that really was my main takeaway is I always believe people are inherently good. Maybe that's a flaw of mine, but they do want to know how they can help, right? They want to know more about this. Most people are a little flabbergasted, not aware of it. And I think giving them the information, whatever ways possible, whatever reaches them, and then showing them how they can help and what they can do, that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for that too. I am just thinking about, again, like general public education and how that's important as well. And you actually don't know who you're reaching out to who might have connections to FGMC that are unknown. Maybe it's friends or family. And I feel like that's something that I've seen in my own work a lot of times where we've been giving training or just uplifting it. And then I've had many experiences where someone will come up to me and like, for instance, a teacher who realized that their student had undergone it that they'd had years ago and they didn't make that connection until later on. Or just again, that education piece. I think because it's so silenced and people don't know a lot about this or what it entails, that you might not even recognize it if you're coming in contact with it or somebody has mentioned it. So that public education is really important. And yes, I want to believe too people want to learn more and also be agents of change in some way or support. So thank you for sharing that. So I think we want to move on to our next round of questions. We did definitely talked a lot about some of the challenges, some of the methods and ways you all have engaged with survivor stories or how survivor stories have impacted the legislation or impacted the conversation on FGMC too. And I'd love to again start with Senator Kaiser. And going back to the legislation that was passed in Washington, I was wondering if you could touch on any challenges or discussions on differences of opinion or thought that came up around the bill and what it should contain, and other supporters of the bill, or just uh, did you and other supporters of the bill feel essentially? One thing in particular that I'm thinking about is that criminalization piece. And I remember there was a conversation around that. And so I wondered if you would be able to chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was an interesting conversation. We are in a time in our state legislatures, at least in our state and some others, of trying to decriminalize, to try and take, especially with drug use and with other more nominal kinds of infractions, trying to take it off the books as opposed to creating a criminal penalty for it. And we've been pretty successful with that. And the idea of creating a new crime was counterintuitive to a lot of our members in the Senate and in the House, because we had been engaged in this decriminalization kind of process for some years. So I originally had conversations with our coalition partners about that issue, and they were insistent that we have some kind of criminal penalty. And it turned out to work out just fine, thank goodness. They wanted that for the fact that they insisted that practitioners in Washington state would not take it seriously unless there was a potential criminal penalty. And that was their key. And again, their testimony and their authenticity and their experience carried the day. It will also be noted that the chair of our Judiciary Committee, which this went to the Judiciary Committee because it created a new crime, happens to be from India. Her family's from India. So she had great understanding and support for the bill and the concept. And that was so helpful, because had it go to the usual healthcare type approach, it would have been watered down, I'm quite sure, and would have simply been an education program. This education program now has teeth.
Thank you for that. I didn't realize that too. And in India, for those who are not as familiar, there's been a case in the Supreme Court for years now, actually, that they have not moved forward with declaring if FGMC is considered illegal or not, or if it'd be protected under religious minority rights. And so that's a huge issue there that many survivors and advocate community members have been trying to uplift and raise. I also, when you were talking, I was thinking about Connecticut, which is a state that SAO has been working with, and there is a Connecticut coalition to end FGMC for 4 years. We have not been even able to raise a bill in the 4 years, unfortunately. We really thought it was going to be raised this year. We had a lot of support, a lot of education. We had a wonderful bill person who was going to be our bill sponsor, and it was not raised. And we actually don't know why. We've been trying to find out, and we don't know why. But previous to that, some of the, it wasn't, I don't want to say opposition, but previous was misunderstanding, was that tension around criminalization and the fact that people did not want to cause that unintended harm. And we had to have a lot of conversations with many groups, even ally groups that we were natural allied groups that worked in other related areas, to really talk about, we recognize that none of us wants to cause unintended harm, but for this to be considered serious, we need to think about it as homicide or domestic violence. And those are things none of us are saying should be decriminalized either, but we need to be able to highlight that this is something that is a human rights violation. It is something that we need to take seriously. Yeah. So that is, we're past that conversation. So that's wonderful. So our next step in Connecticut is hopefully next session, raise the bill. So we'll see. But all right, thank you again, Senator Kaiser. And I would love to move on to Emma. And could you tell us a little bit more about what would you say are the top challenges to delivering effective, non-biased, gender-sensitive reporting on human rights issues like FGMC, both in your own country and then of work, and then internationally as well?
You're on mute, Emma.
Sorry. One challenge is just the myths that surround FGM and that persist. And as I say, the media has been covering FGM in Britain for about 12 years now. But if you walk down the street, I would hazard a guess that if you ask people about FGM, they would still think it was a Muslim practice and or an African practice. So there's still a lot of work to be done to spell out in every story that this is not linked to a specific religion or a specific cultural or socioeconomic context, that it goes across scores of countries and many different communities, and there are many different drivers behind it, and each context will be a bit different. So I think that's something that we just have to keep repeating. I mean, I think maybe including maps in stories can be one way of just showing the sheer spread of it, and fact boxes and explainers, which are increasingly popular now, are another way of spelling out all the different dimensions to FGM. So I wanted also to talk about language. I don't know if this is perhaps the right point to talk about it, but I think another challenge I find, and I notice when I read stories about FGM, is this problem where journalists end up othering survivors, and stigmatizing communities that practice FGM and using terms like barbaric. And I think it's really much more helpful to actually try and focus on the survivors' stories and help readers to relate to them. And that is a more powerful way of getting everyone on board, rather than implying this happens in a small community. So with language, there's also the problem of different communities want to call FGM different things. But as journalists, we have to use very plain English, otherwise you're going to lose the readers and you're not going to engage new readers. So we do use FGM, but if a survivor says they don't like that term, then we could include in the story an explanation of why they don't like that term and why it's offensive, or and then explain what term they prefer and open up the debate in the story. I think another thing thing that is often common in reporting of FGM is this sort of slightly voyeuristic, salacious approach that depicts the parents as very cruel, and sort of wonders how on earth a parent could do that to their children. And I think that's another thing we have to get over, is that parents are doing this because they love their children and genuinely think this is in their children's interests, and it helps, I think, to spell that out and not to demonize the parents that are doing this or the communities that it's happening in.
Emma, that is excellent. Thank you so much. It's a little bit baffling, honestly, when I'm thinking about the fact that despite reporting for 12 years, there are still so many myths that we need to tackle. And I know that it's happening all over. It's happening here, which is why we're having this conversation in the United States as well, and all over the world. Thank you again so much. Language is incredibly important as well. Learning not to other, learning to be inclusive. And I think that is a great segue into my question for you, Milena Mikhail-Debas, as we have two Milenas on the panel today. When engaging with survivors, and as Emma just mentioned, I mean, including a line in your story to explain what a survivor likes or what a survivor dislikes, how do you engage with them in a way where you're saying, how do you engage with them and remember some of the most important things to ensure that your engagement with those survivors is professional, and ensuring that you are safeguarding their experiences, their well-being, and any risks that they could encounter by speaking to you and, the public as well?
Yeah, and so I think I definitely, I think one helpful kind of tip that Maria gave me, and that Emma, kind of touched on, is like around language and what terms you use. I think one of the very simple things you can do is, even just with your interactions with, someone who's a survivor, is to use the terminology that is used within their community. So instead of saying, FGM or, FGC, like and when I was, speaking to members of the Bora community, I was using katna, right? And so just find out what, the specific terminology, that's true to, how it would be described in that particular community, and use that. Because sometimes if you're coming in, it automatically like makes an assumption about maybe how you will approach the story, because it can give off a very alienating vibe if it feels like you're already kind of prejudging. So I think that just one helpful tip that, Maria gave me back when I was doing the documentary. I think more broadly, when engaging survivors, I think, I mean, you could teach a whole like a day long course or like a week long course on this, but I think one of the main things I do try to do is just be very transparent. So what that means is just being very clear on my intentions for the story. What is my angle? What are the questions that are driving my reporting? And also, what will the final story look like? How will their words be used? So when I was working on that short doc, I made it clear that everyone knew that their interviews would be weaved in with other survivor activists, and that the full piece would be on YouTube, but then short clips may appear on social. So just being over communicating, I think is never a bad idea. Um, and then another very critical piece of it is just making sure that you're creating a safe space, which starts with, the very first contact, which is when I ask and just make sure that, the person is actually ready to share their story. And, just making it clear that they don't have to answer anything that they're uncomfortable with. Because, someone may be, on the phone with you, maybe you're the initial pre-interview. This is especially for video. But then they can change their mind afterwards. And so sometimes I think, some, depending on the field you're in or what type of journalism, there is that, like, you have to get the access, you have to get, the secure, and it's in situations like this, just I don't think it should be met with pressure. I never try to convince anyone to speak to me, especially when they're survivor. I just, one, it makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel like it's very unethical. But just being aware of that possibility, like with any conversation, and I think Emma touched on this as well, is um, even if someone decides not to speak with you, it's still an enriching conversation because it will inform your reporting and make it that much more nuanced. So just not putting pressure on those initial interactions. And if I sense that someone is even the slightest bit, hesitant, I I let them know that they can speak, on the record but anonymously. And so for video, I always share examples of other pieces I've done where, we've concealed the person's identity. So I'll give them an example of what it could look like if we distort their voice, if we do like a faceless interview, just so they can have an idea of what that could look like. Um, I also think it's helpful to also be clear on um, the person's intentions, like what they want to get out of the story, like why they want to share their story, and any concerns that they may have, so that you can address them. And sometimes you can't fully address them, to be perfectly frank. If someone is worried about retribution, those, you can't provide any guarantees either. So I think just being aware of of you know what's giving them pause, I think is the best way to kind of engage in a sensitive manner. um, and something else that came up when I was working on this documentary was, just because someone is a survivor activist and they've, repeatedly, publicly shared their story, doesn't mean that they're not re-traumatized with every retelling. So I definitely try to, if I'm engaging with someone who's already been very public, is I try not to get too intrusive or ask for too many details, especially if it's something they've already recounted. But then if it's time for the actual interview, then, I'll ask like my full list of questions, which I'll always preview so they're not blindsided. But you don't need to like do that in the pre-interview and in the main interview, in my humble opinion. And I'll try to wrap this up, but I think this kind of extends, creating a safe space extends into the actual interview as well, where, I'll, before the interview even starts, I'll preview the topics, and just try to be mindful to only ask questions and ask for details that are absolutely relevant to the story and that aren't intrusive. Um, and making sure that, like, I'll try to schedule it for a time and place where they will feel most comfortable and at ease, to open up. So even thinking about, you, they might not be in the best frame of mind if it's, a busy coffee shop after working a 12-hour shift. I'm just throwing out a random example. And that's something that came up when, with the doc, is a lot of the spaces I, wanted to capture, a lot of the activities, I should say, were women only spaces. And so a lot of, sad to say, most of the DPs at the time that were available were men. So I learned how to shoot. That was like the first time I picked up a camera just so I could film those myself. Um, and another thing would be to just, especially when someone is sharing something very traumatic, is active listening. I mean, it's a good thing to do generally with any conversation, but it's especially important, when someone is sharing a very, their traumatic experiences, because it can feel very off-putting if the person senses that you're kind of thinking about the next question and trying to check off boxes. So I always try to, I have my list of questions. I won't refer back to until the very end. And I just kind of I try not to be rigid about the order so I kind of let the conversation flow naturally, because you can always just go back and, you know, pick up on anything that you missed. And with that is just paying attention to their body language. Do they seem to be disassociating at times? Does it seem like maybe you might want to take a water break, maybe switch up the flow of the conversation, just switch topics a bit, take a pause, go for a walk. And I think that's where allowing, um, time, for these interviews is important as well. Like, I don't schedule, like, you know, three different things to do that day. I'll just block out a full day just for that one person's interview, just because you never know. Um, and lastly, after the interview, um, the person may very well be anxious about, like, having shared their story, especially if it's their first time, and be worried about um, any backlash. And so I think just over communicating on when they can expect the piece to come out, what you end up using, and I loved what you said, Emma, about actually sharing some parts of of your pieces so that they know, they're aware of what's going to come out and how it's framed. Um, and I think that all feeds back into my earlier point about transparency. Um, but yeah, I'll stop talking now because I can ramble forever.
It's so important though, so it's great. Thank you very much. We're actually going to take a second to see an example of some of the safe spaces that you can create, making sure that we're being respectful in the way that we're filming videos right now. So I will pass over to my colleague to show that right now. I can't hear the audio. We might have to turn it up on the screen.
Also, sometimes you have to click share audio when you
Yeah,
share the screen.
if you're muted, it's not going to work. Can you come off mute as well?
The private and taboo nature of the practice makes it extremely difficult to know how many people have been affected by FGM in the US, and it makes it just as difficult for survivors to speak up.
It's a traumatic experience. Psychologically, you're done. I was afraid to talk about it for years and years.
If you start talking about this, you can be seen as someone who is against the community.
Activists say survivor stories are a critical part of prevention and healing, so they're creating safe spaces for them. This monthly support group is meeting for the first time.
My name is FA, and of course, I'm a survivor of FGM. I'm not ashamed to talk about it. I'm not afraid to talk about it. The stories may be different, but our pain is the same.
Most of the women were cut as young girls in their home countries. We agreed not to show some of their faces.
The most painful aspect of it, I saw my sister, my junior sister. She was almost dying. She was losing so much blood. So much blood. It was traumatic.
How old was she?
She was like 6 months then. Oh wow.
For two of the women, this is the first time they actually talked about what happened to them, even though they were babies when it happened to them.
We should really target them. Because the one that's silent is for guys. So if we target that population, I believe most likely, chances are very high, sooner or later, it will turn around.
Anti-FGM advocates.
Thank you for sharing that. Um, it's it's really, really important to see different ways that we can approach the subject and also ensure the protection of survivors when we're doing this. So Melina, thank you for sharing your thoughts and this wonderful example that we've just seen. In addition to that, I actually want to transition and ask Maria, I want to ask you a question. I know that you've been my co-moderator, so now I'm going to ask you to change your hat really quickly. Um, so you've been involved from an organizational standpoint, as we've just seen, you've also been an interviewee. I know you've been interviewed on this subject so many times. Um, could you tell me about what the media landscape has looked like in the past, and how it looks right now, in your opinion? Do you think that the accuracy of the issue has improved? Has it changed since then, for better or for worse? I'm really interested to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. I had a couple of thoughts actually when Emma, you mentioned going to global conferences. I think the first time I met you was at Women Deliver 2016, I believe. And that was in, I think it was in Denmark, in Copenhagen, maybe. But this is something I just went to Women Deliver last summer, which was in Kigali, Rwanda. And so I've been lucky enough to go to 3 Women Deliver conferences. And for those who aren't familiar, they are global conferences. The last one, I think, had about 6,000 advocates that work in gender equity from around the world that come and gather. And I was thinking about this because in 2016, there was very little conversation on FGMC and very little reporting that was happening. Emma was one of the reporters that was there and did do some reporting on the issue. And I remember going to the next one and feeling like there was much more conversation. There was actually all-day pre-conference is what they called it. So we had organizations that gathered together. Equality Now was also there to create more awareness on FGMC. And there was a little more media engagement as well too. And then this last time, there again was that day-long conference, but there were just so many events throughout the 4-day conference as well on FGMC. It was too many for me to attend by myself too, but it was amazing in thinking about what it looked like in 2016 to what it looked like now. And along with that, the media engagement that went with that and reporting on FGMC. It was much more this last time than it was in 2016. And I think that speaks to the fact that there is awareness on FGMC and also who was attending. So this last time, I saw such diverse representation from around the world in terms of survivors and advocates who were there and talking about FGMC and their experiences that I just did not see 10 years ago. And so seeing that too, I think again helps shift and show that that communication, that public dialogue is so important. And yes, there has been change. There's still a lot more work to be done, of course. But I think that awareness is growing that this is something, again, that's a global issue. And that's been a huge misconception for so long. So it's going in the right direction in terms of where we're looking towards change. So I do want to mention that. And then I'll just quickly mention another thing is that I was thinking about it for me, and a lot of people might not realize it took me 7 years before I decided to even do an interview on camera. And the first time I did it was with ABC News. And a lot of that was because I had my own fears of speaking out what would happen to my family if I shared my story publicly. Would there be backlash? And also just not wanting to be labeled as a victim in itself. I didn't want that to become my only identity. So I took a long time. I also luckily had some mentors that helped talk to me to make me stop and think about this before jumping in. And then finally I decided that I was at a place where I was willing to talk. But the first time I ever talked to ABC News, they did a video feed, but I did it anonymously, and they were very considerate and did a lot of that, having me in shadow and everything too, and also giving me a pseudonym. And then a year later, I decided finally to come out. They did a second piece, and I did decide to use my face and use my name. But I think that's the other thing, is just to recognize that survivors might be at different places at different times in your engaging with them, or talking to them about sharing their story, and that's okay. And it's it's not easy to share your story in any form of gender-based violence too. But I just want to uplift that too, in terms of my own experience with media and how I myself had to evolve and become more comfortable with talking to media about this. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing. Maria, I just wanted to ask again, I mean, on a personal level, on a professional level, from a NGO organizational level, what do you think real progress will look like when we feel like, okay, we've arrived, and we feel like this is an issue that's being covered ethically and accurately across the world? And again, I mean, we have this little micro lens on the US for this discussion at least. But what do you think that sort of level of success would look like?
I think I mean, again, like, I think that being able to uplift it in the media, showing again the global nature, showing the different contexts that FGMC happens to, connecting it with other social issues too. I feel like that is progress, and not pigeonholing it into one community or one background is a huge step forward. And I think when we get to, and again, that change is happening, we are seeing that. I think also recognizing the fact that there is change happening. I think sometimes we see stories of the problem, which we should be seeing, but we're not seeing that change. And that can be hard to help highlight or even showcase to communities, for instance, that change is happening within their own community. Because I think a lot of times people don't know there's an option not to cut your daughters unless you see that. So I think also showing that positive trend, that abandonment can show and lead us to success. So hopefully that answers what your question is.
Absolutely. It absolutely does. And yeah, just showing the different levels and stages of progress. That's perfect. Thank you. And it helps me with my next question for you, Milena Warnes. Could you share some of the key lessons and or best practices that you've adopted over the years in covering some of these sort of complex, very nuanced, gender sensitive issues, like I'm sorry.
Yeah. So it's thank you for that perfect cue up, Maria, because I was gonna say is what's really important is we focus on the positive that is happening. I mean, yes, I think it's Sir Francis Bean that said, you know, in order for the light to shine brightly, you have to show the darkness, but really focusing on the positive strides that are being made and the hope that's out there, and the people that are making the change and the progress that's being made is what has been best practices for us. You know, we make a joke, and it's not a joke, but it's who's ready for more bad news? Like, nobody wants that, right? I mean, what they want to know is they want to know you have to give them the reality of the situation, but also focus on and this goes to our second point, is what we do is we work with the people in the community that are the ones that are the boots on the ground that are making the change, because each community is different. So what might work in one community might not work in another. And so really understanding those nuances and those partnerships with those communities and the survivors is really important, so you can highlight how everyone can help and what is the best thing that's working for this community. So that's kind of been what we have found as our success to that, is finding out, understanding the complexities. And then the other thing that I think that has helped us is understanding that we are not the experts. These organizations, you are the ones that work on it day in and day out, and going back to those partnerships to help us and make sure that we are putting everything out in the best light forward. I will say Sahio has an amazing media guide that when I even started researching, that was one of the first things I had bookmarked on there. But it's the ongoing partnerships and relationships with the communities and with the NGOs, the nonprofits doing the work, where if I have a question, I can go back as a resource. I can say, is this the best way to frame it? And just understanding that you're the experts, what's the best way. So I think humility, maybe understanding we don't know everything and we're not the experts, has also been a successful way forward to do this.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Melina. I want to open this up to all of our attendees to ask questions to our panel. You can either ask it directly in the chat box, or feel free to one at a time raise your hand and or come off mute. And if there are no questions, then I have some for everyone. Does anyone have any initial questions for us? Okay, well, I will start. What has been your experience pitching or placing your idea when trying to cover FGM? I've often heard, I haven't actually said this, but my background is also in journalism. I know my bio is in the chat somewhere, but my background is also in journalism, and pitching an idea to, if you're a freelancer, to other outlets can be at times a nightmare. Sometimes even getting your editor to sign on to an idea can be really difficult. And so we have the data, we have the statistics. Even if you have an excellent candidate to be the face of your story, it's still really important to stay true to your convictions and try to get your story heard and placed. So has anyone had any issues placing, or any major successes in placing a story idea that they've had? Panel and audience, up to anyone who would like to respond.
I can respond to that. Our project was originally going to be a 1-hour episode, and we got the feedback that it might be better as a 30-minute episode. So that was a little hard for me to understand, because I would watch an hour documentary, but I understand that I'm maybe not everyone else, and that they thought that because of the heaviness of the topic, it might be best suited in a 30-minute format. So that was hard for us to adapt to, but ultimately, I think it led to better storytelling, because we really got to shine more on the characters. But that was hard, because I almost felt like we weren't doing it justice by really diving into the complexities around it. But, I was able to reframe it and say, well, we'll be able to do that in our impact campaign, right? If we don't get them engaged by the character and by telling the true story, they're never going to get to that impact campaign. So that is what we focused in on. And it was an adjustment, but I think it's been great. So yeah, that was one issue, or one where we were met with you need to change the format.
Gotcha. Yeah, that can always be hard, always, especially with, creativity behind all of it. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add about a success or a difficulty pitching or placing a story on these issues? I see that we author also, okay. Is this, yes, this is from Mike. Stigmatization and safety of survivors, yes, can be a great threat to survivors, especially in regions where the practice is deeply ingrained. Absolutely. And we touched on that a few times today. So I hope that for everyone who's in our audience, that we were able to provide you all with a few tools and ideas on how to mitigate some of the risks in handling their safeguarding. So either, hiding their identity or trying to make sure that we can use a pseudonym. I see that there's also another hand raised, and I'm going to put the guides and the reporting booklets into the chat box as well, just so everyone is up to date on all the different tools that we're sharing. Whoever has your hand raised, please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Caroline. My question is, how do you interview a victim who is a child, like a 4-year-old, but it's the parents who are telling the story? So can you show the child's face or just cover the, how do you factor that in there?
Would any of our panelists like to respond to that question?
I think that's I'll take a stab at it. That's a very uncomfortable, like difficult call. I think for me, I typically the times I've interviewed children, obviously with their parents' consent, it um hasn't been around a traumatic issue. But I have sometimes made the call even with some people who seem kind of slightly hesitant. Sometimes I'll just say I'd rather, maybe we should just do this interview anonymously. So uh I would err on the side of, because this story, their parents would follow them for their entire life. And I don't think, I'm not sure how old the child is, but like informed consent is just, I don't think is really possible for a child. So if the parent feels comfortable speaking, I would just kind of keep, they can be on the record, but in your situation, I would be more comfortable filming the child like faceless, like anonymously. But that's just, I wonder what other people think, but that's my gut instinct.
Thank you, Milena. Has anyone else, maybe Emma, have you come across a situation like that in a global context?
I've never filmed, I'm a text journalist, so I've never filmed a child. I have talked to children, not to do with FGM though. I've only ever talked to adult survivors. So I'm not sure what I can add, but except that as an organisation, we would always go through the consent process and get the consent forms signed by the parents. But yes, I'm inclined to agree that better not to show the face, because you never know when that child grows up, she may prefer not to have been interviewed. But I don't have direct experience.
Thank you. Carolyn, we hope that that answers your question. I see
Yes,
that.
yes, thank you. It does answer my question because I was worried that the child might get traumatized second time if the face does come out and people start making fun of her. So it might be more trauma for her. So it's best to hide her face. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have another question from Magdalene.
Hello, good evening. Actually, mine is not just a question, but it's more to build up on Caroline's question. When we are telling their story or when we are covering a story around violence, or let me say per se FGM, it is very important to be cognizant of the child safeguarding. And or if you are working with an organization, it is really key for you to have a child safeguarding policy whereby you have like the intent to tell the story of the girls or the child in particular, but not to expose their faces or just be cognizant of the fact that they grow up, they're not going to be children forever. And when they grow up, are they going to be happy to listen to the story that was told about their lives, or even just to see their faces out there? So it is really, really important for us to be very cognizant of their protection, and also the fact that they're growing up. And maybe this is a situation whereby they've passed, it's a phase in their lives, and they will not be able to maybe understand that there is a reason as to why that had to come out at that particular time. So it is always just not looking at the moment, but looking at the future of these girls. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I am going to pass over again to my co-moderator, Maria. I believe that we are almost at time, and I don't think that there are any more questions. If anyone else has anything else that they would like to raise, please do. We will share the links once more in the chat box to our toolkit and the additional resources. But otherwise, Maria, I'll pass over to you to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Yes, I think we will be also sending an email out to everyone who has registered, so you can have those resources. And I think we'll be able to send the recording, correct, to everyone who's registered?
Yes.
Great. So thank you to all of our speakers. I think just to close out, because I know we have a couple of minutes, I would just like to open it up if any of our speakers have any last words or anything that you would like to share that we haven't had an opportunity to uplift or ask you a question about. Okay. Well, if not, I just want to say thank you to everybody. This was such an enriching conversation, and I really appreciate you all being here, really sharing with us your own experiences, and us being able to uplift the role of media and communication, and really thinking about that multi-sectorial approach to ending FGMC and how important it is. I think at the end of the day, too, just really recognizing that FGMC is this silenced issue. So us being able to uplift, taking it out of that realm and making it public, that's just so vital to creating change, because we can't create change if we don't talk about things. So thank you again. I think the conversation really helped to uplift that, but also uplift how can we do that in ethically considerate ways and gender sensitive ways as well too. So thank you again. Thank you to the audience for coming and for participating in the chat box, for asking your questions as well too. And I think if there's nothing else, we will just say have a good rest of your day or night wherever you're located. And thank you everyone again. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.